When we started talking about this episode, I think at least when I was pitching it, started off from the very naive place of, well, why don't we just talk about who's the greatest player of all time? And our ability to stick with that, topic and that, theme for an episode lasted all about 30 seconds as we realized, oh, wait, that's impossible. You could never define that. And how would you do it? I mean, I think that was where a lot of our more interesting discussion kind of came about. This was, how do you even talk about who the greatest of even an individual decade or era is?
You mentioned DiMaggio and Williams, and I remember being the best player in baseball was something that was bandied about before I was even born. I think DiMaggio and Williams might have been one of the first of those to say, like, well, how do you compare these two guys?
Well, do you think they were comparing like Addie Joss and some of those guys,
Chrissy
like
Mathewson
back in the day?
No, I don't think they were doing that.
Well, I also think that the discourse around sports has changed so much with the average fan able to get articles and discuss in a way that they weren't doing and actually watch the games themselves. You're going to definitely be able to have more arguments about, well, who you think is better because you actually watched them play.
I think it was the 1941 AL MVP that really set this into the best player in baseball. That's an interesting idea because that was the year that Ted Williams went 6 for 8 in a doubleheader, the last game of the year, to bat .406 when he was batting .399.5 and could have sat and had his average up to 400.
Instead he hit 4.
He goes, nah, I'll play.
And
he goes out and he goes 6 for 8 and he dominates the league and he loses the MVP to Joe DiMaggio, who didn't have any particular stat that year that was better than Ted Williams. He just happened to play for a Yankee team that was on a ridiculous run from 1936 to 1939 and again in 41. And so the Yankees always got first sort of look at stuff like that.
Right, even though you argue Williams had a by far better season.
I think so, and that's not to slight. Well, I guess it is a slight to Joe DiMaggio.
It's not a slight in as much as you're just saying, Williams had a better year that year.
Right. And DiMaggio had 30 homers, and he did lead the majors with 120 RBIs. But Ted Williams hit 406, and now that was the year that DiMaggio had the 56-game hitting streak. So I think that really played into the MVP voters' mind, going, the guy hitting 56 straight games.
And you could sort of look at that as sort of a proto version of the who's the greatest of all time argument, because I'm sure people that are fans of both of those players would go back to either the fairness or the unfairness of that MVP and say Williams should have won it, or DiMaggio, hit 56 games in a row and had an unbelievable year. You can't discredit that.
Right, so those two things, right, 406 and 56 games are juxtaposed.
Matching up against each other. Then we then went, okay, we can't do greatest of all time. That's not going to work. Well, what about, doing the greatest of each individual decade? That doesn't even work either, because you have guys that it's career.
Guys don't just say, okay, I'll come up in 1941 and make sure that
and the bulk of my career is now
I'll be really good for those 9 years or 10 years.
Because if you're going to talk about the greatest pitchers of the 50s or 60s, the problem you have is Sandy Koufax basically started pitching in 55 and retired in 65. So would you pick 5? And his best years were basically in the middle of that.
And he is the greatest pitcher of all time. I think I would say, even though it was a short career, the level of dominance he showed at a time when baseball had already made a lot of advances, I would probably pick him as the greatest pitcher of all time, because even after that, there hasn't anybody better than Sandy Koufax.
Right. But Sandy Koufax also got to pitch on a mound that was 5 inches higher than anybody's getting to pitch today. So do you start making the arbitrary line of, well, pitchers after 69 when they lowered the mound?
As of 1969, they lowered their mound by 5 inches. That's true. And I really never think about the fact that how much of an advantage, because all the pitchers, and it was the 1968 year that everybody went pitching crazy with Dan McLean's 31 games and Gibson's 1.12 ERA, that like, okay, these guys are too darn good. Kind of something we hear today sometimes.
Except it's going the other way now, where you've now got guys hitting today that are getting access to better training, more video, more looks at the pitchers. They're better hitters than ever. So wait, are we going to punish the pitchers today by making them lower the mound and pitch against better batters?
Weren't we just talking about the fact that batting averages were as low as they've ever been and the pitchers had to? So we're kind of holding both views at the same time as fans.
We were like, oh yeah, the hitters are better than ever today, except they're just doing worse than they've ever done before.
But so it's worthwhile comparing DiMaggio and Williams, because it's just too perfect not to compare DiMaggio and Williams.
Right, and when you look at the numbers, it's pretty crazy.
So DiMaggio, and DiMaggio played from age 21 to 36, and Williams from 21 to 41. Both of them served 3 years in the military in the prime of their careers. That kind of cancels out each other, right? Like that's
they both lost the same number of years. They both lost prime seasons, so it's not like any one of them suffered more than the other.
And the career stats, to me, favor Ted Williams, and basically, it gets even better when you add in another guy that I threw in there who didn't start. So DiMaggio started in 36, Williams in 39, and Stan the Man Musial started in 1941. The difference is Stan Musial only played 1 year that he had lost. And so his career stats, because he played more games, he had more plate appearances, and he was awesome. His stats look a little bit better than you might think.
The problem is now that we've been talking about, Musial losing a year to the war, and DiMaggio and Williams losing 3 each. I'm thinking, what were they doing when they went out to? Because the U.S. government knew who these guys were. Are you going to really risk?
Williams was a fighter pilot and had all these missions. He shot down
He was in it.
He was crazy good, of course, because he had the most ridiculous eyesight. I don't know if you ever noticed that was with the 2010 eyesight and the whole thing. But when I started with Ted Williams and DiMaggio, I looked around going, well, was there anybody else? And I came up with Stan Musial. So let's compare them a little bit.
So yeah, when you throw in Musial, he actually looks really good.
He looks really good, and I think the hardest thing let's look at Ops Plus, right, which normalizes on base plus slugging for the ballparks you play in. So that's sort of trying to flatten it a little bit,
which especially matters back when they were playing because they played in some goofy ballparks.
So Musial looks good because his 159 is a little better than Joe DiMaggio's career 155. So right away, if I said 159, I know you, right? 159, 155, that's ridiculous.
That's so good.
Right, that's so good because Ted Williams had a career Ops Plus of 191.
Right, and so when you say that, it's kind of hard to say either of those guys were better than Williams as a hitter, at least.
Right.
And obviously, the thing with Musial, everybody always talks about is how they had him as a pitcher, and then one day they had him take BP, and they're like, that man is a hitter.
Right. He had hurt himself, and they said, that man's not a pitcher, he's a hitter. And so obviously, the reason that DiMaggio comes closer to Williams all time is because DiMaggio was a far superior fielder.
Right.
And he played center field, and
he was a good center fielder.
He was an excellent center fielder, and so he's got a positive D-WAR for his career.
Whereas Williams was
slightly negative. I don't want to say he was bad.
He's not a bad fielder, but
he's not Joe DiMaggio.
Right. But the thing is for Williams, the fact that he was at best a slightly subpar, at worst a slightly subpar fielder, I should say. You're going to take that every day of the week when he hits like he does.
Right. And Musial was a better fielder than Williams, but not anywhere near what DiMaggio was.
Right. And so he was kind of the middle ground between the two of them in terms of hitting and pitching, or hitting and fielding.
And to your point about decades, so because DiMaggio played from 36 to 51, Williams from 39 to 60. Those guys played a long time. 39 to 1960.
That's wild.
Now, he had the 3 years off, obviously, as well. And Musial played from 1941 to 1963. So, it's just such a long time.
So if you're a Musial guy and you're trying to support his claim that, he's one of the best of all time, is he the best player in the 40s or in the 50s?
No, he's the best player in the National League.
Yes.
That's what I would say.
A cop out. Nice that he was the best player in the National League, and then it's DiMaggio versus Williams.
And he didn't have DiMaggio and Williams to compete with, and he was, as far as I'm concerned, far and away the best guy outside of that.
And it also, I think there's something that adds a little bit to the mystique when it's a Yankee player and a Red Sox player.
So true.
Not only were they rivals against one another, their teams were rivals, which it adds that little bit extra mystique to it.
And not that being a Cardinal, by the way, in Stan Musial's case.
No, but it wasn't like they
played the Red Sox in the World Series in 46.
Played when Musial played, and you had him as a Cub to go up against Stan if their careers overlapped a lot more.
The careers overlapped. Unfortunately for Ernie Banks, the playoffs never did.
No.
So that was his. So that's where this all started, right? So the best player in baseball. And if I had to pick at that time between Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams, I would have done what you've done. Maybe I would have said Williams is Ted Williams always wanted to be known as there goes the best hitter that ever lived.
I think you would, and it kind of gets down to how we sometimes talk about the MVP. Williams might be the best hitter that played in that decade. He is the greatest hitter of that decade. But you can make the argument, I don't know if we're going to put that forward here, but you could make the argument that DiMaggio was a better overall player because of the defense he brought, and that's what would make it. But this is the debate,
and the clutchness, if you will, of DiMaggio, because the Yankees were perennially really good in going to the World Series a tremendous amount of time, and they won a bunch. Whereas Williams, they didn't do that.
They didn't win.
They didn't win. So that really changed things in terms
and
of the ability to play in those
that's something
pressure
that even
situations.
usual can lord over Williams. Is the Cardinals won World Series when he was there? The Red Sox never did.
And so the Cardinals, Musial started in 41, so they won in 46. But no, they didn't win another World Series.
But Williams never got one.
No, he never. I don't think he only got to the one in 1940. I didn't really think of this. So he would have played, except I don't know if they were done with the war. No, 46. So they must have played in the 46 World Series against one another, and the Cardinals won that series.
So head-to-head, even Musial gets the win.
I think it was 43, 44, and 45 that they were in the service.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that launched us forward, going, okay, so what if we try to do it, like Gordon was saying, by decade, which we've already failed miserably,
we already that doesn't work.
At that aspect. So it's like, okay, the other, like when I was younger, like Hank Aaron and Willie Mays. Okay,
and they're both outfielders, at least.
Right, they're both out. Although one was a center fielder and one was not.
Right, but generally, when you're classifying this, you're either going to kind of stick strictly to position. You're only going to measure a center fielder against a center fielder, or I'm going to measure outfielders against outfielders, corners against corners, middles against middles, catchers and pitchers separately, because. How am I going to say, if I have the best pitcher of a decade and the best hitter of a decade, how do you say which one between the two of them is better? It's not like it's the same thing in football. Tom Brady might be the greatest quarterback of all time, but that doesn't make him the greatest football player of all time, because there's offensive linemen who had a completely different responsibility. Sandy Koufax and Ted Williams had completely different responsibilities. You see the same thing in hockey. I think basketball is kind of the only one where you could just have a definitive one guy is the best, because all the players kind of have the same.
There's only 5 guys on the court at one time, too.
And they all have the same things available to them, and their expectations of them are only based on their skill sets, not like literally what they're on the field to do.
By the way, Jason Kelce, who just retired, I think he's going to retire from the Philadelphia Eagles at center today, is going boola boola when you said offensive lineman could be as good as Tom Brady. He's like, yeah, that's me.
Well, but I think it's important, because if I look at Roy Campanella at catcher, and I'm going to talk about him being one of the greatest catchers of all time, somebody can't make me go, yeah, but what about Willie Mays? It's just like, well, he played in the outfield. It's a totally different thing.
So, and you would think because Willie Mays played in center field, obviously, and was a fantastic center fielder, we all know that. Aaron was a good outfielder. I think he played right field more than he did anywhere else.
I think if I had to think about this, just knowing what I know, the two of them off the top of my head, I have to imagine Willie looks way better here.
But Ops Plus.
Okay.
155 for Willie Mays. 155 for Hank Aaron.
Wow. Especially because I feel like Henry Aaron
was his preference.
Right.
So
I feel like Henry Aaron is a bit underrated
I think,
nowadays.
in that, when you see that particular stat.
Because he's kind of gotten the reputation from baseball fans as almost a bit of a compiler.
Oh, that is... Well, here's why. Because he never hit 50 home runs in a season.
Right.
Okay, so for the greatest home run hitter before Barry Bonds of all time, with the 755 breaking, to not hit 50 home runs, that says longevity.
Right. That says so I think that people have mistaken that longevity for compiling.
Except that Aaron hit, if you want to use batting average as a measure, 305 for his career. Tim Mays is 301.
But that's what I'm saying. People don't realize.
Right, that's like, wait a second, he did a lot of other
Aaron
things.
hit 305 for his career. I bet a statistic not a lot of people actually think about.
Mays had a better on-base percentage, only by 10 points, 384 to 374, and they slugged virtually the same.
But I can think that Willie was an infinitely better fielder.
Only because of his amazing range and ability to play the most difficult outfield position.
And Aaron was a good
outfielder.
Defender.
He won. I think he won a Gold Glove, but they only started.
And Willie stole bases.
Willie stole bases. Oh, did he steal bases compared to Aaron? Although Aaron had 240 stolen bases to Mays' 339 career. So again, another thing that you don't know, like Hank Aaron had 240 stolen bases, right? And so they were really good. And then I decided, well, let me just throw in the other guy who started playing a little later than that. He didn't start till 1951, although Aaron started in 1954, believe it or not. Mays really started in 51. He played in the Negro Leagues in 1948. So we're going to say that ostensibly he really started playing in 1951. Mickey Mantle And I thought, Mickey Mantle,
Like he kind of, and I feel like Mantle kind of gets forgotten a little bit.
not by Yankee fans.
Not by Yankee fans, but by the rest of baseball. Like I feel like he's more known for being a character than the player sometimes.
Oh, that's so cool because you know what his career ops plus is?
I guess 160.
172.
Woo!
Okay, 172. So we just went through Hank Aaron and Willie Mays at a career ops plus of 155.
He's better than by like 20 points.
He did that in Yankee Stadium, which he's a switch hitter, so that means he batted right-handed enough that the left field didn't help him at all.
And I think I don't have enough appreciation for Mantle as a player, just because I like he's not talked about in like for whatever reason. I feel like he gets.
You got to listen to Francesa; he'll tell you all about it.
It's just like just think about Mantle. What's the thing what's the thing I think of when I think Mickey Mantle? It's not even him. You think Marilyn Monroe?
That's Joe DiMaggio.
Oh, that's Joe DiMaggio. Ah.
Right. And Mantle, you know, I think any Yankee fan that knows Mickey Mantle when he played and his career will say, oh, yeah, until the injuries got to him. Right. So he's another one of those guys. So even though he played for 18 seasons in the major leagues, the last 5-6 seasons were really injured seasons, and he did most of his damage in the first 10, 11 years.
Right. So he's one of those guys where it's like the 16 seasons are a bit misleading, and if anything, they hurt his stats because if he had played 16 seasons like he would be almost on a different level.
So I just didn't think when I compared the three of them together that Mantle would show this well against those guys. And here's the thing in my mind. I still would pick Willie Mays and Hank Aaron over Mickey Mantle, even with the 172 ops plus. And I'm not sure why I feel that way.
Longevity, maybe?
Just, yeah. And just having it tougher. I think having it tougher, being black players coming into the game after Jackie Robinson, those guys just managed to overcome it and excel. And I can't use one stat like Ops Plus to say, well, that's why he's better.
And I think, and one of the things that has been talked about is just the insane amount of racism that Henry Aaron faced when he was chasing Babe Ruth.
That's what I'm saying.
Like the fact that he powered through that and was able to be successful despite so many people being against him for such a stupid reason.
And the injuries, right? So Aaron played almost 3,300 games, and games at the end of guys' careers, you know, they're just games you kind of put on the docket. Mays played 3,005 games. Mantle played 2,400 games. That's a big difference.
That's a big difference.
That's a big
when you're
difference.
like 600 plus games less than the other guys.
When guys have 14,000 at bats for Aaron almost, and Willie Mays 12,005. And Mickey Mantle didn't have 10,000 at bats.
Right.
That's a big difference.
Right, especially because you speak to the idea that, one, I think you can use this to both support Mantle and hurt Mantle.
If he played longer, he'd have hit more than 536 home runs.
It speaks to the absolute greatness of Aaron and Mays for how long they were able to sustain this. But then you think about Mickey Mantle playing 6 injured seasons towards the end of his career. What would have his stats been like if he had just been healthy through that?
And that's
period?
is where Yankee fans are at when it comes to that player. Although rarely will you see Mantle, Aaron, and Mays sort of put together. Mantle, it's Willie. Maybe I said Willie, Mickey, and the Duke.
Yes,
you know, because they were all out of New York, and Aaron wasn't a guy who was put into this. So we kind of just threw him in because he played around the same time.
This is going to be a completely insane statement that makes no sense. But do you think it's because there are more color TV highlights of Henry Aaron playing?
Huh.
And so he's not thought about of being an era guy with those guys.
So to your point, I would say very interesting. So how is Mickey Mantle perceived outside of the metropolitan New York area?
When I think of Mickey Mantle, I think black and white.
Well, you should.
When I think Willie Mays, I think black and white.
He played actually longer than Mantle did.
When I think Henry Aaron, I think color TV.
Well, and he finished his career, I think, in 1975 or 6 with the Brewers, so he ended up playing the longest. Mays finished, I think, in 73 with the Mets.
Right, it's just interesting, but all of Mays' highlights are from early in his career when they were at the Polo Grounds still, and they were playing in black and white.
And Mantle, and Mantle finished in 68, so you're right that though that would be black and white, more black and white film of Mickey Mantle, you might have seen late career film of Aaron and Mays when it was definitely color.
Right. Because Henry Aaron's 715th home run was in color.
Right.
So that's a highlight I've seen hundreds of times. So when I think about that, it feels like he's from...
Those guys run out there every time and try to run with him, right? Every time you watch them.
But you think about it, in my mind, they're from 2 different eras, even though they were contemporary.
That's a great point. And I think it just has more to do with the way TV changed.
And the way we perceive time.
Because on the basis of that. So, I guess, that those guys were kind of interesting to compare at that time. We'll do one more decade going forward.
Yeah.
And when I talk about I call it the 50s to the 80s. I picked two guys that aren't normally compared to one another, I think.
And I don't think you're arguing either of these two are the greatest of this period.
They're up there because I look for other guys, and that's Frank Robinson and Carl Yastrzemski. And they didn't start playing at the same time. Robinson started in '56, and Yastrzemski didn't start till 1970.
They played
61.
forever.
And they are both in the Hall of Fame. So everybody we're talking about here, obviously, are Hall of Famers. And when you look at, because they played about the same amount of seasons, it makes it a little easier, although Yastrzemski played 3,300 games to Frank Robinson's 2,800. There are 3 MVPs amongst the two of them. 2 of them went to Robinson, 1 in each league, the only guy to do that, and 1 to Carl Yastrzemski. And Yastrzemski played at that point as well as did Robinson, where the pitching was so tough until 1969, and he played a lot longer after Robinson did. So,
right, but when I look at their stats, I feel like Robinson just kind of sweeps him.
Yeah, let's see. Look at the Ops Plus: 154 for Frank Robinson, 130 for Yastrzemski.
586 homers to 452.
Now, where Yastrzemski gets it back is in the D-War because Robinson was. I didn't realize that he had a pretty severe negative D-War.
He was a first baseman.
No, Robinson was an outfielder.
Robinson was an outfielder. My mistake. Okay, never mind. I was about to give him a free pass. He does not deserve one.
Outfielder, and Yastrzemski was a career D-WAR in left field of 1, which just means he's basically a neutral defender.
Right, which is
not a bad defender, which you might interpret a guy at negative 14.8 WAR for his career as being, well, you didn't do that because you were good.
Right, but he put up 107.3 WAR for his career, did Robinson, and Yastrzemski was 96.
Right, and they played in the same era. So what I always think about is Yastrzemski kind of gets slammed because I think he got a batting title one year, I don't know, 1968 maybe, or 67, or 301, and he barely hit 300 to win the average.
So for whatever reason, average in the American League that year was particularly
really
low.
bad, and that's when they started making the changes and all that. And so Robinson was never a guy who hit for average. By the way, that wasn't. He was much more a power hitter.
Still hit a career 294.
He's
better than Yastrzemski.
Right, and yeah, I guess the overall WAR totals in this particular case, of 107 for Robinson and 96 career for Yastrzemski, indicate that if we had to give a nod, I would feel to Frank Robinson. But I don't think it's a comparison that really goes all that often.
No.
So how about third baseman of the 70s? And there's a pretty easy comparison between 2 other Hall of Famers.
Yeah, I mean, you've got 2 guys from the same era in George Brett and Mike Schmidt. And it's interesting because from where we are, I've heard so much about Schmidt that it's hard for me not to just pick him.
Michael Jack Schmidt. They always would pronounce his middle name, and they're talking about like that was an important thing.
But George Brett was just a way better ball player than I think people today give him credit for.
Okay, so let's go to the tape. Who's going to come up better between? And by the way, there's such a great comparison because Brett came up in '73, a year after Schmidt did in '72. Brett played till '93, and Schmidt actually played less times until 1989. Brett played 2,700 games. Schmidt played 2,400 games. So we're really close.
11,000 plate appearances to 10,000. These guys played the same people for about the same number of games.
So if you thought without looking at any stats, you'd say, okay, who was the home hitter between them? Schmidt. Who was the average hitter between them?
I want to say Brett, but I could see it being Schmidt.
Well, remember remember the year that, or are you aware the year that Brett hit 390 and he chased 400 the whole year?
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, that was a big
Brett
deal.
was like a career 300 hitter.
Well over 300 career hitter. So a 305 career hitter to Schmidt's 267 career batting average. Okay, that doesn't bode well for Schmidt, except when you get to Ops Plus, again, you've got a 148 for Schmidt and a 135 for Brett. That's a 10% difference.
Right.
And it's on the defensive side, and not that Brett was a bad defender.
But Schmidt was Schmidt.
Schmidt was a special defender at third base.
Right. He has a career 18 D-WAR at third base compared to Mike Schmidt's, George Brett's 1.
And as clutch players, I think they were both really great players to count on in the clutch. Well, you know,
clutchness is as much a function of the games you've watched as anything else.
And they had, I'm not calculating off the top of my head, but they had, to me, similar opportunities in the postseason.
They both got World Series titles.
The Royals and the Phillies weren't like teams
but
that
they won.
They won World Series. They won enough, that kind of stuff. So, yeah, Brett, if I had to pick between the two, it'd be really hard.
It would be really hard.
It'd be really hard. So the last comparison we'll do, and this is one that kind of started us, is Greg Maddux and Randy Johnson.
And then we were going through with Greg Maddux and Randy Johnson, and then quickly we realized, well, we have to add some other guys in here because it's not fair. Because Roger Clemens started around this time, and so did Pedro.
Right. So it started because it started with Maddux starting in '86 and Johnson starting his career in '88, and they both pitched 22 years for Johnson and 23 years for Maddux. So it seemed like a real nice comparison. When you add in Clemens, he actually started before in 1984, and Pedro didn't start till 92. That's a full 8 years after Clemens. So that made it a little hard to compare them as contemporaries, but it's still too fun not to do that. And if you look at, what stat would you say is most telling about them? Because all of these guys would be Hall of Famers, if not Hall of Famers.
I mean, the problem is you can't really just pick one of them because they're all so good. I think the thing that impressed me is how well Clemens stacked up against Maddux and Johnson in here. Because Johnson, where Johnson clears Maddux is in the strikeouts. Because Johnson has 4,800 to Maddux 3,300.
Right.
Clemens has 4,600.
It's like wow! I didn't realize how close he was to Randy Johnson in all time. And the career WHIP for Clemens and for Randy Johnson is the same.
That's just wild.
117
for starters.
That's crazy good when you have a guy doing that.
When you have guys striking out guys like they did.
The ERA plus thing, which is I think a measure of earned run average against everybody else. So the higher the number, the more you are betted relative to 100, the league itself. And the one who came out on top of the four we're talking about was not Clemens, was not Johnson or Maddux. It was Pedro Martinez.
Well, Pedro had the best ERA for his career for all of them. He's the only guy with a career ERA under 3 out of all of them. He's at like 2.9, and the other ones are like between 3 and 3.1 or 3.2.
And that would add to the fact that, Maddux's career whip, we said the 117 for those guys is 114 for Maddux. The career whip for Pedro, 105.
Right.
Career.
That's
career. He didn't at the end of his career, he didn't suck.
No. And I always go back to, of those guys, who had the most single dominant season? It's hard not to pick that Pedro 99 season.
Well, I think that's traditionally what you hear, right?
That's like one of the most unbelievable pitching seasons anybody's ever put together.
And so all of these guys did, and Pedro pitched the least out of the 4 guys. He only pitched 18 seasons.
Yeah, only.
Do guys even really Kershaw's going to end up pitching a lot of years?
Scherzer.
Yeah, but
we'll be talking about them.
Who are the guys now that are pitching in the major leagues who are going to have 20-year careers?
I have no idea.
Right.
Guys don't do that anymore.
And so that's and that's not a slight. Just tells you how hard it is to play Major League Baseball. I think.
Yeah, because you're not going to see too many 20-year pitchers anymore.
So I think we started here saying Randy Johnson and Greg Maddux, and I think you could, because they were so different pitchers in terms of the way, aside from being left-handed and right-handed, just the way they approached pitching. By the way,
yeah. It's so interesting because if you had to pick a guy for a season, I was saying this. To me, if I was picking a guy for a season, it's kind of hard to pick against Maddux because I know so much of what I'm going to get with him. But if I had to win a single game, it's hard to move away from guys like Clemens or Johnson just because if Randy Johnson's on, he might be as close to as unhittable a pitcher we've ever had in baseball.
Certainly at that time, but I think I could make a case for any one of those 4 guys.
I would take any of them.
Any of those 4 guys.
Pedro at a big game? Oh, yeah, I'll take that.
So I'm glad we don't
watch that.
I think the idea of trying to come up with, who's the best pitcher of the generation, all that kind of it's obviously going to be subjective.
Right.
It's
going to be very opinionated.
Right.
It's going to be fun.
And it's going to be really fun. And we're probably going to do this again. So if you have another idea for people we should maybe compare.
If you thought we left out or if there's from an era we should talk about.
We're getting lots of emails and
I'd love to hear about who should be the greatest of all time from pre-1900.
Oh, God. That's, I'm out of my league.
Yeah, now you're really getting back there.
That's really nice. So anyway, thanks for listening. And definitely, if you've got a good one, send it to us.